And you would build these underground bases. They were all over the world. They've been built by other nations also. And part of this led into his NATO operations, but the thing where he left was most interesting. He was online for, and he said 2.5, 3 years retirement for NATO, formal retirement, with his salary at that time in NATO had gone up to something like $500,000 a year. This is a salary.
Wow.
And his retirement was slated to be $1 million per year retirement. He was an extremely important person at a very high level, had high-level clearances. But he said what changed his mind and he decided to walk out on everything was the fact that he was invited to attend some UN meetings, the very classified ones, which were not held in New York at the UN terminal and the UN buildings, but in a deep underground military base. And they said there was a facility which had all of the layout exactly like they have in the UN headquarters in New York, underground in this base. He never told me where it was. But there was an extra row of chairs, or a ring table and a row of chairs above the rest, which was not extant in the usual settings for the UN, for the meetings. Everybody would go in there, including spectators were there, himself and some other people. Everybody would sit down and be waiting, and then the final group came in, would sit at this upper tier of chairs. They were all tall grays, extraterrestrials, 7-footers.
Like the ones he shot in Dulce?
I don't know if he ever shot a 7-footer. He didn't tell me particularly whether it's a 7-footer or not, but he said the ones that came in on the UN meeting were the 7-footers, and they dictated policy to the United Nations. He attended not one but 2 meetings of this type. And he says after the second meeting, he says, I am working for the wrong people. Had a conference that day with some of his NATO friends in the NATO Department of Geology, I believe is what he called it. There's a whole group of about 40 of them. They all decided they wanted no more of any part of it. They walked out on retirement, salaries, everything. All 40 walked out the same day and wiped out the NATO's Department of Geology. And he retired.
Because obviously what Phil's saying is that we blew off an atomic bomb that caused the earthquake, right?
That's exactly correct.
Now,
there was a tactical nuke in the harbor, which was planted by, as he said, Navy SEALs. And it followed a long argument between the United States government and Japan over the fact that Japan was the world's leader in synthetic intelligence computer technology. And all of it centered in Kobe.
Right. So, what happened with the executives?
That's an unknown, to me anyway.
Kobe
was leveled, and particularly the building which contained most of the research for this was leveled. And he told me that 70% of the Japanese scientists working on synthetic intelligence computer systems were living in Kobe and were working on that project there, and it was leveled. And that put them out of business, and the U.S. government probably, whatever elements in the government, it can't accuse the whole government, it's certain sections within it, probably felt satisfied. There was no repercussions that I know of, but at the same time, those executives learned what Phil had to say regarding the facts of what happened, and what may have happened after that, I have no idea. In Area 51, and a very interesting incident that occurred out there. He had business during the time he was working for the government to go out to Area 51 periodically and see some particular officer in I think he said the Air Force, I'm not positive now. Mr. So-and-so is not ready to see you right now. Please have a seat in his office. Oh, and by the way, just keep your eyes straight ahead. Don't look from side to side. And when he's ready, he will call you. Of course, tell that to Phil, and he's going to have other ideas. What is it they don't want me to see? So he let his eyes wander, and he saw a window, probably one of those slanting windows, where he could see through partially. It was a dark-colored glass. He could see through partially and see that there was somebody behind that glass. Eventually, he got to talk with the person he was to meet and talk with, what his business was, and so on. He took care of that, and then he asked the guy, he says, there's a smoked glass window out there on the other side of your office. What's this all about? He said, oh, that's one of our guests. I said, one of your guests? What do you mean? He says, one of the guests of the government. And what do you mean, guests of the government? He says, oh, that's one of the aliens we keep around. Aliens? Yes. What do you mean? He says, well, we have a few guests, you know, from the UFOs that have come down and so forth. And said, we got a reptilian in there. He says, we've had him here for months. We've been trying to get him to talk. We can't. He said, he won't talk with anyone. So Phil looks at the officer and says, why don't you let me try? The guy looks at Phil and says, you? He says, what makes you think he'll talk with you? He says, I don't know. Why don't you give it a try? He says, well, everybody else has failed. Why not? So he was prepared for this. He said, this is a special room. It's got special atmospheric mixture for him and a temperature of 123 degrees F. You have to go in a suit, an air-conditioned suit and so forth. And you have microphones and speak and all of the appropriate apparel. And
you're saying the reptilians can't live in this atmosphere?
oh, they can. But this guy was being kept in the atmosphere which was more normal to what he was experiencing, would normally experience. They kept him in an atmosphere which was essentially the same as his home atmosphere.
And where was his home?
That was not mentioned to me.
Okay.
So Phil went in there, and he said he was in there 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And this guy, when I say guy, I assume it was a male, started coming out with a bunch of pips and squeaks and high-pitched sounds. Now, being that this creature was about 6 foot tall, one would expect a lower voice. But if you have some rare gas mixtures, such as argon, helium, whatever, it's common knowledge, of course, if you put a human in a high helium mixture,
they sound funny.
They sound funny. Their voice goes up in frequency because the propagation rate through the gas is a much higher rate than normal air.
So is that the problem?
That was apparent part of the problem. So eventually Phil did get to talk with this creature, and they exchanged some thoughts and ideas. He was trying to speak in English, but it didn't come out very well.
Because of the gas in the room.
Because of the gas and so forth. Perhaps he didn't know the language that well. I do not know the reasons. But eventually talked with him.
Okay, so Phil actually got them to change the gas?
I don't know whether they did that or not.
Okay.
But in any case, Phil reported back to the officer later. He says, yeah, I got this guy to talk and such and such and such. Well, at the time when Phil admitted this to me, I asked him, I said, what did the guy tell you? What did he talk about? He says, I don't feel comfortable about talking about that at this time. He never did tell me. But he got a permanent assignment for 3 months there as the official interpreter for this alien. And nobody else could talk with him, but except this guy would talk with Phil.
Wow.
So what information came out of that, who knows?
But It's too bad.
The government was trying to, of course, to interrogate all of these captured aliens that were still alive and find out where they're from, what they were doing here, and whatever they could get out of them. And apparently it was a fairly successful program. Things that he was aware of was the huge pile of UFOs, of wrecked ones that we had, and that we were shooting down UFOs at the rate of approximately 7 a month. And
did he see these piles of UFOs?
Yes, he did personally.
And where were they?
He didn't specifically state where in the U.S., other than there was more than one. There were several piles of them. But he said while he was in Russia on NATO business, he looked into the matter over there, and he said they had football fields. He said fields full of junk UFOs covered 2 football fields. I said they were shooting them down at the rate of about 1 a day. And I said, well, what about the occupants? He says, I don't know what happened to any of the occupants. But he said the orders have been out for quite some time. This would mean prior to 95. That anyone who comes in to the Earth closer than, as I was told, a 250-mile periphery above the surface of the Earth, a 250-mile zone, safe zone for us, any closer than 250 miles above the surface of the Earth, they'd be shot down no matter who they were, friend or foe. They had to have clearance to come in closer, no matter who they were.
Well, see, I would say, the listener would say, if these guys, these UFOs, these extraterrestrials, had the capability to do space travel, couldn't they counter our defensive measures?
Not what we have now. In the underground, when we were doing a bore for preparation to build an underground base, they said the typical procedure was they bored a large diameter hole, large enough to run a captain's chair down through. It was about 6 feet or so in diameter. And it could be earth boring, it could be laser, it could be whatever. But they bore this hole down, it says, anywhere from 1 to 3 miles. The goal typically was between 1 and 3 miles, no less than 1 mile. But his job was, when they had it down to the depth they wanted, he would go down on the captain's chair, literally, physically down in the borehole, and examine the rock structure at the bottom to see if it was a kind of rock structure that would be possible to use to create by blasting their underground base. He says more than once it happened that as they were boring, they hit an open area, an underground cavern system. And he was dropped down, the first one of these, where it happened that way. He was told, get on the chair and go down and find out what's down there. Well, I took lighting with him. He said he didn't know what to expect.
Is this the Dulce Wars you're going to talk about?
No, this is before the Dulce Wars.
So there was another one.
This has nothing to do with Dulce Wars.
Ah.
This is in the standard procedures of building the underground bases.
Wouldn't it get hot? I mean, I could imagine if you're being lowered down 3
No, this
miles.
is another great misconception. I've done a lot of spelunking in my life, and this is one of the strange things they tell you. In all of the natural caves and natural cavern systems, they are the same temperature the world over, averaging around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, night or day, summer or winter. They vary maybe plus or minus 2 degrees from that. But they hold right around 52, and regardless of the depth, they're still 52 degrees. Now you say, well, what about volcanoes? They have a special structure, and apparently the volcanoes, of course they're hot. You got molten rock. But there's no truly accurate theory to explain why you have volcanoes with all this molten lava, which is assumed to come from the center of the earth. It does not. Why we have volcanoes is still something of an unexplained mystery, and even Phil couldn't come up with an answer on that one. But he went down on this one case on the chair.
So this was before the Dulce Wars.
This is before the Dulce Wars.
Good.
You go down to the chair and go down to the left, get out of the chair. He's wandering around in a very dim cavern system, very foul air. Apparently sort of breathable, but very foul air. And with his lighting, he looked around there, and he wandered. He thought he saw a shadow or something moving. He wandered around one of the corners of this cavern system, was face to face with an alien. He said he looked at it looked at him. If I remember correctly, he described it as a reptilian. But he says it went for something on his chest. It had some kind of a plaque or thing on his chest.
Now, he describes this story on the
But he said he pulled out his 9mm Ruger that he had in his pocket. He wasn't supposed to have in his suit, but he had a hunch to take the gun with him that day, and he did, and he shot this thing dead before it got him. He said this happened more than once.
Well, I thought this was the Dulce Wars you're talking about, because he said that 60 or so soldiers actually got killed in that exchange.
In the exchange in the Dulce Wars and the Dulce Tunnel, but this was a totally separate phenomena. See, when he was talking about exploring, this is when I'm saying private conversations.
Okay.
He was exploring these caverns when they hit them. When he went back up finally and told them what happened, he said he got the impression that they knew all about it. And he says eventually he learned the government knew where these underground caverns were and that they were inhabited.
So how is that experience different from what the Dulce Wars were?
The Dulce Wars was going into a base they already knew, already had. It was originally a government base. It was turned over to the aliens, and they took it over completely and eventually kicked out the scientists, wanted to run it entirely on their own. The government wanted it back, and this was in New Mexico, of course, and my understanding of the history of it, it was originally built as a storage depot for nuclear waste. But the governor of New Mexico at that time says, you're not dumping that nuclear waste here in an underground facility in New Mexico. You're not going to use it for that, even though it's already been built for that purpose. Eventually, it was adopted for the, I guess what one would say, the underground labs and experimentation, which took place at Dulce. The aliens were invited in. They more or less took it over, and then eventually totally took it over. But in the attempt to get it back from the aliens, some 66 people went in fully armed, or they thought fully armed, and only 4 or 5 total came out. Phil was one of those that came out alive, all injured, had to be carried out by Marines they brought in just to carry them out, and even the Marines were hit. And he recovered slowly. He had severe burn marks. He had a hole in his chest and other burns.
So that's a different experience.
Totally separate from what
than the one he talks about with the alien who shot him
single
in the chest.
one-on-one where he shot them. Dulce was not one-on-one. This was a known number of aliens at the other end of the tunnel, costing 66 people, including most military, heavily armed, or they assumed they were adequately armed, and literally took all of the military out. They had weapon systems we did not have at that time. I was given a phone call by his ex-wife a few nights before the February conference was to start in Florida for Global Sciences, because he was to be a speaker, he was a scheduled speaker there, and he was going to come up to Atlanta from there and do some major videotaping on what he knew. He kept saying, I have lots to tell you, I've only scratched about 1% of it. And he says, I want to put it all on record.
Oh, it's too bad we don't have that.
And it's too bad that he never got to it. But in any case, that's what he said he would do. And on that night, I believe it was the 10th of February, I got a call from his ex-wife saying Phil is dead.